former host of Redacted tonight. I say former very unfortunately, and we're going to get into that here in a moment. Lee, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
I was hoping we could actually just start before we get into the actual order of events. I know there are a lot of people who get a little bit squirmy about RT America. I think there's a lot of bad faith criticism of RT America that falls under the kind of McCarthyism umbrella. I do think some people, though, have some legitimate questions about the funding and things. Can you just kind of put to rest some of those concerns and put that in context with the rest of the media?
Sure. Big question.
Yeah.
You don't want to ask me how my morning was first?
Yeah, exactly.
No. Yeah. So RT. So I'll get into my show in a second, but RT America is was part of RT International, which is funded by Russia, just like BBC is British, CBC is Canadian, France 24, I think it's called, is French. CGTN is Chinese. Now, America, we have a slightly different thing here. I mean, we do have NPR and PBS, which are somewhat government funded and government controlled, but we also have all of the others, the most massive news channels in the world, like CNN, Fox News, that claim, well, we're not state-funded media, right? But in fact, we have we have a corporatocracy, essentially. We have ruled by the corporate state. Political philosopher Sheldon Wolin called it inverted totalitarianism. It is the totalitarianism of the anonymous corporate state rather than a single egregious leader. And so you don't need CNN to be funded by the State Department for them to do America's propaganda just 24/7. It is the corporate state that owns all. Basically, the same corporations that own CNN or Fox News, et cetera, own our government. The person who spends the most on their election wins in the Senate 80% of the time, in the House 90% of the time, and the two candidates who spend the most win 100% of the time. Well, where do they get that money to spend millions of dollars on their campaign? They get it from corporate America. They are therefore owned by corporate America, and there's many studies that have shown this is true. So anyway, I just wanted to say that although CNN and MSNBC and et cetera are outside of the state-funded media banner, the truth is there is no difference from them doing state-funded media propaganda. Now, to go back to RT America, yes, the funding came from Russia, but many of the people there were American. I mean, almost everyone in that office was American. I was out of the DC studio, which was the main studios. And so I had my show there, Redacted Tonight. For those who don't know, it's a political comedy show. It ran for 8 years, 375 episodes. But the difference between, say, my show and the shows at CNN, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, CBS, etc., is that I wrote every word I ever said. I researched everything I ever said. I was never told not to say anything. I was never told to say anything, and I was never censored. Now, that type of freedom absolutely does not exist on our other news airwaves, and maybe to some extent our airwaves, our television airwaves in general. So I had this immense amount of freedom, as did all the other shows there, such as Jesse Ventura, former governor, obviously, Chris Hedges, former a Pulitzer Prize-winning war correspondent for the New York Times for 10 years, Larry King until he passed away, but. So I had this immense amount of freedom, and I knew why. The reason I was there is because I knew there was no other network that would ever let me do this. I'd been doing stand-up comedy I'd been a full-time stand-up comic for 15 years before I got that TV show. And there was no corporate network was interested in anti-war, anti-imperialism in a really strong and adamant way. Sure, they'll have The Daily Show, which I'm a fan of their comedy, but in terms of an actual deeper criticism of our corporatocracy, whatever you want to call it, our massive capitalist imperial system, there's almost none on daily shows. So that's just one example, but the same goes for the other corporate comedy shows that are out there. And like I said, they don't write every word they say. They have teams of writers, which, if I had enough money, maybe I'd have a team of writers. But anyway, so hopefully that kind of sums it all up.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned Ventura because I remember when MSNBC booted him for being anti-war. So it's to put that in perspective now is pretty remarkable. They
paid him in an interview I did with him. He said they paid him upwards of $10 million just to get out of his contract, just to make sure they wouldn't have an anti-war voice on their airwaves.
And yet now look at right. This is absolutely remarkable. So for those who haven't actually followed what's occurred, can you just walk the audience through what the last couple of weeks has what's actually happened here?
Sure. I mean, the mainstream media wants to act like RT America shut down because they lost some distributors. I think DirecTV and maybe Roku or something stopped distributing them a few weeks ago. But that, and I don't know the exact reason they shut down, but to me that sounds ridiculous. They had plenty of platforms that were still going. They had a big online presence that was still going. They had enough staff. Even if they needed to cut back, they could have cut back to just news or something. So there's a lot of avenues that could have been tested before just shutting down the entire thing. But that's what they did. You know, it was a week and a half ago on a Wednesday. We come in, they say there's no programming and they're going to let us know. And then we come in Thursday and we have a large meeting where they say, hey, it's all over. Grab a mug on the way out. Thanks for all your work. And yeah, there's no written contract that says government sanctions shut us down, but I think it's pretty obvious government sanctions shut them down.
And what was their explanation for this? What was RT America accused of having violated?
There was no explanation. I mean, if you want to go back to previous sanctions on them, then they were sanctioned back in kind of 2016 because they were accused of getting Trump elected by Russiagate, which even if you're a MSNBC lover, you should by now know that every tenet of Russiagate has collapsed. There's, I hate Trump and I hate Biden. I am not a Trump lover. I'm more critical of Trump than probably CNN is in many regards. However, Russiagate was laughable. It is completely collapsed. And yet that was used as a reason to get RT America as labeled as foreign agents, even though that registry had only been used for lobbying firms until that point. The point of that act was to label literal lobbyists for other countries. However, AIPAC, one of the largest lobbying firms for another country, Israel, has never been labeled a foreign agent. So RT was the first media outlet to ever have that designation, that scarlet letter put on them. And then now we've done it as well, I think, to CGTN, the Chinese broadcasting, and maybe another one. But and of course, that started down this terrible precedent of news media is no longer news media. Media coming from a country that the American empire doesn't like is now not a media agency, but instead a dark and secret agent, a dirty secret agent working for the enemy. And so, yeah, you just saw this continued purging. I mean, the suppression was crazy. My show went from 200,000 views an episode on YouTube to a tiny fraction of that, and we were never given a warning. There was no email that said you've done something wrong. It was just massive, shadow banning and suppression, algorithmic suppression. So there was a lot of that going on. But as for the past couple of weeks, there was no reason given for why RT America was crushed and shut down. YouTube recently took the added step of banning all RT America programs on their YouTube banning the YouTube videos worldwide. And they did give a reason. They said that it had to do with either glorifying or diminishing violence or something like that. I can't remember their exact phrasing. But of course, first of all, I'm anti-war, and I said on my show I'm opposed to Putin's invasion. But I also gave context because we're adults here. We should understand the context of the situation. Expansion of NATO, U.S. funded and created coup in 2014, et cetera, et cetera. But we can get into that in a minute. But so I was very clearly opposed to this war and all wars. But that didn't stop YouTube from being like, oh, you've diminished violence because you dare speak any of the reality of what's going on in this world. And of course, it's also laughable, YouTube's reasoning, because what is CNN, Fox News, MSNBC? What is their job? Their job is to diminish American violence every day, all day. Their job is to either outwardly ignore. That's the number one thing they do. Outwardly ignore, let's say, the 377,000 killed in Yemen with our bombs and our technology.
Yep.
or the estimates now are 6 million have died from our wars on terror over the past 20 years. 6 million innocent people have died, whether 1 million directly and 5 million indirectly. And their job is to basically cover that up. Sometimes they actively do just full on fake news propaganda, Russians paying the Taliban to shoot American soldiers.
Oh God.
And then it comes out a week later, and they'll like the Washington Post will publish something a week later saying, "Oh, it turns out that wasn't true," but it's a tiny blip.
Damn, it's done.
It's done. It served its purpose.
Yeah.
They'll admit they got something utterly wrong, but of course they get it wrong intentionally. So.
Yeah. Well, and I've actually watched a bit of your coverage about this, and you were no simp for Putin. You did not condone or justify the invasion. You did provide the context. As you point out, the mainstream press. I mean, we were dropping bombs on Somalia while he invaded. Did they talk about that? Did they? I mean, it's really quite incredible. I saw. I don't know if you know Alan McLeod with Mint Press News, but I
love Alan.
He did a wonderful piece. He found that over, I don't remember the time period, but the media had done over 1,300 pieces on Ukraine. They had done 2 combined on Yemen, Somalia, and Syria. So, it's just the comparison is so stark. I think it's worth pointing that out. So can you talk a little bit about the power big tech has here and what kind of implications that has for independent journalists going forward?
Yeah, it's completely crushing to independent journalism. And people may point to certain shows and say, well, they're still there and they're still doing well. Well, usually that has to do with the fact that they're not actually threatening to the rule. Either they're small enough that they haven't really gotten on the radar, or if they're bigger, it usually has to do with the fact that they're not actually threatening to the ruling elite. They're not actually threatening to the power structures that are in control. And again, I'm not some, tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. There's a large Princeton study from 2014 showing that America is an oligarchy run by a tiny group of business elite. And when the American people want something to get done through the federal government that does not align with corporate interests, there's essentially a 0% chance that will ever happen. So this is not some conspiracy theory. This is, proven out by actual studies. But anyway, it is crushing to independent journalism. And that's part of their goal, is to kind of create an example and cause a chilling effect. That's part of the reason that Julian Assange has been locked in essentially a cell for the past 10 years, is because he created a good example, basically, for people. Hey, look, we can reveal the reality of what's going on behind closed doors of our ruling elite and learn about the crimes that are being committed, not just of America, but of countries around the world. And he said, I'm not going to publish anything that's false. It's all accurate. It's all 100% true. And here it is for you to decide what to do with that information. And for doing that, for both revealing their secrets and for being 100% accurate, he's been tortured and imprisoned for 10 years. And that's designed to create a chilling effect on journalism, on publishers, on revealing of quote unquote state secrets, which nowadays they print state secret. They stamp state secret on just about anything that they, it could be their lunch order. They'll just stamp it state secrets. So, but the platforms, YouTube, and this has been evident since 2015, 2016. My personal Facebook page, which I got up to 330,000 followers, has been essentially shadow banned since 2016. It gains no followers, and it is shown to only a tiny, I did the calculations once. I think it's 0.1% of my followers see most of my posts. And so they have you build up these platforms where you think you are going to be heard and you think you can get messages out there and your journalism out there. And then they just basically pull the carpet out from under you, or slowly erode it like a sand castle in a wave. And we've seen that on just about every big tech platform. Now, there are alternatives that are being built up. I think those are important and people should look into those. But I also think that, unfortunately, these big tech platforms they're massive, and they're you can't just ignore them. If you delete your, let's say your Facebook, and you go over to, let's say you delete your YouTube and go over to Rockfin, That's good, but the problem is you deleted your an access to millions of people to go over to a place that has far less. So I think we have to build up the alternatives while still using the tools that are there for us. Just don't assume that tool will be there tomorrow.
Yeah. And unfortunately, as we build those tools up, they often then end up getting bought out and consolidated. And, so we have to be careful about that as well going forward, because I remember, just it wasn't all that long ago, maybe a decade ago, you really could actually build up a channel on YouTube as an independent, commentator in a way that you can't now. And
That's how I got started. Yeah.
Exactly. I remember that's how I got into politics. I was watching independent stuff on YouTube, and the related videos would all be independent and stuff like that. Now it's all fucking Fox and CNN, and it's just insane.
That's one of my favorite techniques for basically suppressing dissent or dissident voices is if someone does happen on to, let's say, a Redacted Tonight, my TV show videos, which now are all banned, but when they weren't,
right.
If someone did stumble onto one in about 2015, 2016, rather than the autoplay going to another Redacted Tonight video, which would make sense. Someone liked the video, they watched it to the end, maybe they want to see another one. Rather than that autoplay doing that, it would always gently push the people back to the mainstream. It was basically like saying, "Oh, little fella, you've stumbled into an area that's not acceptable for corporate, state talking points. Here you go," and they push them gently back into John Oliver or CNN or whatever.
Absolutely the case. So can you just give? I'm curious what your views are on. I'm actually, perhaps naively, but I'm even surprised by the extent to which the media has just gone full bore for a war in the Ukraine here. I mean, it seems like, I'll put it this way. A lot of people in my life who are like lefties and who do care about Yemen and Syria and Palestine and all the rest and are aware about those things, even they seem to be perhaps emphasizing Ukraine with more of a sense of urgency as a response to this media coverage. I guess the extent of it all is just kind of overwhelming. Can you talk a little bit about how the media has covered the invasion?
Yeah, I mean, when the war machine kicks into high gear, it's like trying to punch waves. It is coming. And there's almost nothing you can do. I mean, besides the fact that I lost my job and all my videos have been banned, and now I'm resorting to patreon.com/Lee Camp. Despite all that, I just mean in general, exempting my situation. This to me is very interesting. What's happening right now, because it's not so. First of all, I've already said I'm opposed to Putin's invasion. I'm opposed to all the bombs being dropped. I'm also opposed to the neo-Nazis that have been waging war in the Donbass region and murdering 15,000 people in Ukraine for 8 years that almost no one's talked about. But so I've made that clear. But what's being done right now is they're actually kind of weaponizing Americans' empathy to stop a war, ostensibly to stop a war, right? Because your average American says, Russia, stop your bombing, right? But what it's really being used for is to keep the war going. It's an interesting Orwellian trick. What needs to happen right now is that Ukraine and Russia need to sit down at a fucking table and sort this out and come up with a peace agreement. And unfortunately, take America out of it. I mean, I get that Ukraine is kind of an American puppet government right now, but take America out of it. Ukraine and Russia is 100 times more powerful militarily. So unfortunately for Ukraine, if they want to keep everyone alive and have this not just end up in some sort of Aleppo-esque absolutely destroyed country, and long-term, firefights, then they largely have to just give in to what Russia wants. But actually, if you look at Russia's demands, they're not insane as the mainstream media would have you believe. But that aside, and so your average American, and I have family members and stuff who think all that matters right now is Ukrainians and just help the Ukrainians. Well, how do you want to help the Ukraine? Do you want a peace? Oh, no, we don't want peace. We want NATO to create a no-fly zone. We want to send bombs, and we want to arm grandmas in the streets of Ukraine. All that does is create more death and destruction. The U.S.
Yep.
right now is getting a powerful propaganda win against Russia. They're getting powerful sanctions against Russia. This is I mean, of course, Russia views this as useful to them, but the U.S. views this as useful to the U.S. And the U.S. wants, the U.S. government and the U.S. military-industrial complex wants this to last as long as possible. They are using Ukrainians as cannon fodder while they run around and go, oh my God, can you believe Ukrainians are dying? So the average people are being used as cannon fodder in a proxy war between Russia and the United States. And the only way to deal with this and stop it is to sit down at a peace table until it's done. No-fly zone is basically like asking for a nuclear war. Because in order to put in a no-fly zone, you are saying that NATO or whoever will shoot down Russian jets, and then you're basically at nuclear war. So everybody, apparently it's like 75% of Americans say they want a no-fly zone because it's a euphemism that sounds really nice. Kind of like moderate rebels. We're going to arm the moderate rebels. There's no such thing as moderate rebels, all right? And so as we're seeing in Ukraine, we're arming Nazis. And they're not even secret Nazis. Many of them have like swastikas on their helmets. These are
got the fucking lightning bolt S patch on their shirt. Like they're not hiding it. Yeah.
These are full frontal Nazis. All right, folks. Yeah. And then we're called conspiracy theorists for saying there's Nazis in Ukraine. I mean, that's one of the main reasons that so much is being banned right now is simply the story of the U.S. funding and arming these Nazis in Ukraine. But yes, I think that your average American's empathy, which should be a good thing, is being used in a very Orwellian doublespeak tactic to make the Western world support kind of endless war in Ukraine.
And I think there's a nice comparison here with what we've actually seen in the last year or so in Afghanistan, right? When we went to pull troops out of Afghanistan, the media went into high gear to oppose that. Oh, the humanity, right? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, when there's 23 million Afghans in food insecurity, right? Starving Afghans. Then we no longer care and silence, right?
The big thing was you have to protect the women of Afghanistan by keeping U.S. troops there. But now that U.S. troops aren't there for the most part, we are going to have an economic war in Afghanistan that will kill tens of thousands of women. Well, so
perhaps
what happened?
Even more than the war did. I mean,
Yeah. So what happened to caring about the women? Oh, we only care if it's, related to having troops there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about you'd mentioned earlier Chris Hedges, and I believe wasn't one of the reasons that he left the Times also to do with his opinions on war?
Yeah, he was a Pulitzer Prize winning 10 years at the New York Times, just did amazing coverage for many of the skirmishes and wars and battles. And everyone should read his book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. It really puts what's happening right now into contrast. And he basically came out against the Iraq War in the lead up to the Iraq War, and they essentially forced him out. A lot of people will, the mainstream media, I think the New York Times did an article on like me and some of the other RT people the other day. And they said Chris Hedges, chose to leave the New York Times because he said that he didn't like their war coverage or something like that. But the truth is they made it impossible for him to work there. And that's one of the tactics of a organization, an outlet that doesn't want to be seen as firing someone who's anti-war. They just make it impossible for them to work there till they leave. So, there are career graveyards filled with people people's careers who came out against war in one form or another and were purged from the system. Phil Donahue was the top-ranked show at MSNBC and into the lead up of the Iraq War, and he came out against it, and they got rid of him. Jesse Ventura, I already went into. There's examples on CNN too. Ashley Banfield, who eventually came back to CNN once she had her lobotomy, but she came out against the Iraq War on camera, and they basically, I can't remember if it was MSNBC or CNN. I think it was CNN, but they basically kept her in her like 3-year contract and just had her sit in a room with nothing to do for like 3 years. It was like they put her on timeout and she could not be seen on camera again. And the list goes on. Some of them don't have to do with war. It just has to do with being anathema to the corporate state. Ed Schultz was pro Bernie. He wasn't even that left wing. He was just pro Bernie Sanders. And he was, even though he had like the second highest rated show at MSNBC, they kicked him out of the system. And he ended up at RT America. So the list just goes on and on. And Melissa Harris Perry, I found this one interesting. Melissa Harris Perry, I think it might have been because she asked questions about Palestine and stuff, but she was a well-known African-American female host at MSNBC, probably at the time, I think the only African-American female they had. And, for various subjects, they boot her out. And she then does an interview on Democracy Now! And says that she was censored from all kinds of things. Like the example she gave is she was going to do a segment on Beyonce's Super Bowl halftime show that had just happened. And Beyonce and her dancers had on Black Panther inspired outfits. And so Melissa Harris Perry was going to do a segment on how this was powerful for Black voices. And basically the head of MSNBC came running in 5 minutes before the show and said, "You're not covering that." So imagine a network that is so censored, you can't even cover Beyonce's Super Bowl halftime show.
Now imagine that network criticizing independent journalists of somehow being in the pocket of some other state. That's all the more ridiculous. Yeah, and one of the things I like to point out is that on these cable news networks, like if you're ever sitting there watching CNN, and if you are, I pity you, but sometimes you'll see a commercial come up that's like for fucking Boeing, and it's like, can the audience members afford a 737? Like, that's not why they're advertising on CNN. You ask yourself why they're advertising on CNN, right?
I love that. I love that point. I've made that point many times that, those ads are just to basically own the network. It's, if you do bad coverage, we will pull our whatever, 10, 20, $30 million ad budget a year from your airwaves. And so CNN's not going to rub them the wrong way.
Of course not. Nope. The last thing I wanted to get to here is I'm curious, what are your thoughts on some of I think there's a lot of dangerous McCarthyism going on right now in how Americans are talking about Russian products, Russian people, Russian virtually anything. And some of the distinctions we see between how oligarchs in the United States are referenced in the press or referenced in pop culture compared to how oligarchs in Russia are referenced in pop culture in the press. Can you just talk a little bit about that and what kind of pitfalls that has?
About the weapons, sorry, something. I thought.
No, you're good.
I thought
you're good. The McCarthyism.
The McCarthyism is obviously, we've been through this before, and it's sad to see America just redo our history, but it shows that it was useful. McCarthyism is useful. It shuts down dissenting voices, and it really, in times of war, it clears out those who are an infection to the ruling elite, to the pro-war oligarchs that run things. And, when I say at times of war, it's kind of funny now or interesting, I guess, maybe not that funny, that we're always in a time of war. But the difference is most of our wars go on without Americans even knowing, without Americans even paying attention. The new thing, it didn't used to be. In Vietnam, people talked about the war a lot, whether it was fake news or not. They were talking about it. But the past 20 years has become, we just keep bombing Afghanistan for years and nobody really says much. Or we are bombing in Somalia and it's a blip on the radar, never really talked about. So when I say in times of war, I mean in times of war where the United States machine is telling every American to care about war in one way or another, either to get us to invade or bomb, like with the buildup to Syria, or in this case with Ukraine, ostensibly to stop the war, but really to keep the fighting going on for as long as possible. In those times, you see usually a heightened level of McCarthyism. And sometimes it can be, not just anti-Russia, it could be an anti-China McCarthyism, etc. But it really does gear up. And of course, that's what we've seen in the past few weeks. These banned YouTube channels, whole networks being shut down during those times of a buildup for war. And right now, I guess what we're seeing really is a buildup for intensive Cold War. Let's hope it's not a nuclear exchange.
Right.
But in this buildup for intensive Cold War, they need to manufacture consent from the American people. And they're trying to manufacture consent for a very intense Cold War, a Cold War that could send many countries in Europe's economy collapsing. It could send the cost at your gas pump to, $7, $8 a gallon, maybe more. And so they need to manufacture consent for this. If they just do it without manufacturing consent, then people aren't willing to pay $8, $9 at the pump. And guess what? You end up with a large scale resistance. You end up with large scale protests that are not easy to quell. So they have to manufacture consent for that. Well, many of our politicians are saying that that it's what our job for democracy to pay higher prices at the gas pump, or our mission for freedom is to pay higher gas.
Well, and by the way, like Exxon and Chevron have record profits. They're just price gouging. It's not like yeah. So on two fronts, we're standing up for big oil, and it's outrageous.
Yeah. So during these times, you see heightened McCarthyism, and many of these various structures get activated that haven't been as activated. U.S. sanctions, your mainstream media maybe directing their focus in different ways. And they are the white blood cells, in the human body, the white blood cells rejects infections. Well, those of us speaking the truth, those of us anti-war, those of us anti-imperialism, those of us who say nationality is toxic, if you really get into it. I mean, at least with the way it's used now, we live in a toxic nationality world where people hate someone else simply for being born 2 miles away across a border. That who knows who even came up with the border? Like, who put that line there? Doesn't matter. We just hate them because they're over there. Those type of people, those who are anti-imperialist, anti-war, revealing the truth, whatever it is, they need to be purged from the system. And it's done in a bunch of different ways, but the white blood cells kick into gear and they try and purge these people from the system. I obviously, as just one example, not just, I don't know if I mentioned this, I didn't just lose my job, lose my TV show, lose my YouTube channel, 8 years, 375 episodes, actually 500 episodes if you include my interview show as well. Lose all that, but they also deleted my personal podcast, Moment of Clarity, from Spotify, and of course, there's just the endless suppression. So all of these things happen.
And just to clarify, Lee, your podcast was not part of RT America, is that correct?
So that podcast, Moment of Clarity, it had some of the audio from Redacted tonight, but it was not owned, connected, anything with RT America other than me using some of my own audio, my own voice from Redacted tonight.
I see.
But yeah, and so all of this kicks into high gear in times of manufacturing consent. And it may seem with the war in Ukraine, well, they're not manufacturing consent. In fact, we're all opposed to the war in Ukraine, but they're manufacturing consent for a level of Cold War that we haven't seen in decades.
Yeah. Well, Lee, I really want to thank you for taking the time today, and I want to encourage the audience to help Lee out. I've had his Patreon up on the screen throughout this interview, but obviously he's just lost his career here, his livelihood. I hope that you can get back on your feet in one form or another here, but this censorship is just beyond outrageous, and it's concerning on a whole number of levels, and I very much appreciate you taking the time to come here and highlight that.
I really appreciate you having me on. And yeah, if I can get enough small dollar members on patreon.com/Lee Camp, then hopefully I can bring back something that has a similar feel to Redacted tonight. There may never be another Redacted tonight exactly, but hopefully something that has the same feel.